Where am I here? Oh, so then just want to remind everyone next week, we don't have a seminar, but we do have a number of our summer undergraduate interns giving presentations. So we have 8 marine studies interns who are going to be presenting on Thursday morning, and there will be an announcement out on the HMSC community listserv. Same thing with Friday. We have an all of our remote REU summer interns also presenting their research Friday morning. And so that information will be out on the HMSC community listserv. And here we go. All right. So I am delighted. I am so delighted to introduce Carmel Finley, historian of science, Oregon State University. She's going to talk a little bit about the book that she's written or is completed. Is that correct?
Not yet.
Almost. Yeah, it's on Bell Shimada's journey, 1922 to 1958. And I want to highlight that Carmel is a historian of science. She's interested in the development of fisheries and fishery science in the Pacific. Carmel started out as a newspaper reporter covering ocean fisheries, and after the West Coast ground fishery collapse in the 1990s, went to the University of California, San Diego for a doctorate in history science studies in 2005, and then a research fellow at the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, Germany. She is now a historian of science at Oregon State University. And with that, I will let Mary take the helm.
Okay, well, can everybody hear me? Or if you can, I'm going to be fine. Okay, I'll just get going. Thank you so much for the opportunity to do this talk. We had originally hoped to do it last July in conjunction with the recommissioning of the vessel, but the COVID-19 kind of got in the way and we had to put things off until now. I've really enjoyed pulling this story together, and I've been greatly helped by Alan Shimada, who is Bell's son. Some of you might know him from NOAA in Silver Springs. So he gave me access to some of his father's papers, and he'll be joining us at the end of the talk. And I think that Commander Amanda Geller of the research vessel Bell Shimada may also be with us. Alan is going to give a bit of an update about what's happening with the book, or with the boat rather, I'm sorry, at the end of the talk. And I'd also like to welcome someone who might not be here, because he was also having some computer problems today. And that's Bob Heitz, who is a retired fisheries scientist. And he's writing a memoir about his years of exploratory fishing in the 1960s on board the John Cobb. So it was Bob and Bell that really got me interested in this story about exploratory fishing. So what's this talk about? I'm going to take a look at Bell's remarkable career, and I'm going to place his work in the context of what other federal fishery scientists were doing after 1949, and they were exploring for new sources of fish for their fishermen to catch. And I also want to recognize the contribution of Japanese scientists to the development of recruitment fisheries oceanography, which I am defining as the study of fish in their environment and how they are recruited into the fisheries. So let me get started. I have a lot of ground to cover. You might Google Bell Shimada and up comes the pictures of the boat, but when I think of Bell Shimada, I think of this guy. This is a University of Washington photograph. I'm not sure where it was taken or when it was taken, but Bell covered a great deal of territory during his very brief career. So it begins really in 1922. He's an immigrant family living in Seattle. He goes to Franklin High School. He excels at math and science. He graduates and he goes to the University of Washington School of Fisheries. And in 1942, all Japanese citizens in the United States were taken to 10 internment camps across the country, and Bell wasn't allowed to finish his semester. He wound up in Minnesota, Idaho. And during that time, he wrote a letter to William F. Thompson, who was the director of the School of Fisheries at the University of Washington. And I found this letter in the special archives at the University of Washington the last time I was up there. And it's an incredible thrill for a historian to touch an artifact of, something that somebody has touched, and a letter about something that is, deeply, deeply important and personal to them. And in the letter, which is handwritten, he thanks Dr. Thompson for his efforts to help him. And he says that he's going to volunteer to be an infantryman to be a soldier during the war, and that he hopes that someday he'll be able to come back to the University of Washington. And the file also had Thompson's reply, which was, just an extremely kind letter saying that he was sure that, Japanese citizens could do anything that they could put their mind to, and that he looked forward to the day when Bell came back to the University of Washington. It was a very nice set of letters. So Bell has an enormously busy war. He's sent to the internment camp. He volunteers for infantry training. He does intelligence and language training. He's posted to Honolulu. He's in Florida. He's just in all sorts of places. May of '45, he's in Guam. And 3 months later, he's in Tokyo as part of the American occupation of Japan. And he is part of the natural resources section of the American occupation, which was an extremely important division because the Japanese people were starving. They went on short rations earlier in the war than anybody else did. And one of the first things that General MacArthur wanted to do was get the Japanese fishing fleet back, fishing and catching fish and helping to feed people. So one of the real successes of the American occupation is the rebuilding of the Japanese fishing fleet, which unfortunately is a little too large for its own waters. It was too large in the 1930s when it was being built. And it was too large now. It turns out to be really easy and quick to build fishing boats, not so easy to decide what to do with them. But Bell is in Tokyo during this time. He's discharged from the Army as a private in February of '55, and he stays in Tokyo for another 6 months before he comes back to Seattle, University of Washington, and the School of Fisheries. And I have his grades from undergraduate grades, fall quarter of 1947. And I included this slide for Bob Heitz because the leading student in the class with a 4-point is Al Prouder. And Bob told me that Al Prouder was one of the smartest people he ever met. And it was Al who hired Bob to go to work on the John Cobb. So this slide is in here for Bob, and also for some other people who might be there who would recognize some of the names. Ken Henry, Arnie Dahl. Bell here is 6th, and as you can see, he's a graduate student. 7th is Jürgen Westerheim, who did so much work on West Coast groundfish. Ernie Jeffries. 11 is Dayton Lee Alverson, certainly a very illustrious career. And 15th, it's cut off here, but you can't see it, is John Bevan, who goes on to be a director of the School of Fisheries at the University of Washington. And on the other side, this is really kind of inadvertent, number 35 is John R. Donaldson, who winds up being the director of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So you always find really interesting things when you're in the archives. It's just always really illuminating. So Bell graduates, actually I've gotten a little ahead of myself. Bell graduates in December of 1947, and he hangs around University of Washington doing his master's degree. So we're going to kind of shift gears and look at what's happening in the wider world. War is over, World War II is over, the Cold War has started, and Americans have paid a great deal of blood and treasure for the Pacific Islands that they occupied at the end of the war. And they are interested in, maintaining that position and those interests within the Pacific Rim. So Honolulu becomes very important here. Honolulu, this is the statehood for Honolulu, takes place during this particular time. The battle begins. Of course, it doesn't happen until 59. But in 1947, actually, the Farrington Bill is introduced. And Joseph Farrington is the delegate from Hawaii. And the bill doesn't pass the first time around. It's rewritten, and it passes in 49, and it funds 3 oceanographic research vessels and a new federal laboratory in Honolulu. And this is a really big deal because it is the first federal research money that's spent on oceanography in a couple of decades. The United States has not spent money on oceanographic surveys. And all of you probably recall when Ed Ricketts wanted to go poke around in the Gulf of California with John Steinbeck. He had to hire a vessel. He hired the Pacific Flyer in order to do that. So this was a really important and significant development, the creation of these 3 ships. And there was a program that was created, the Pacific Oceanic Fisheries Investigation, headquartered in the new lab in Honolulu with the 3 ships. And the director is Oscar Eldon Seti. And I would argue that his role in the development of oceanography has, I think, been overlooked. He was a senior scientist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Through the 1920s, he was the director of the North Atlantic Fisheries investigations in the Gulf of Maine. He does his doctorate in the 1920s at Woods Hole under Henry Bryant Bigelow. And Bryant Bigelow was very involved with Johann Hort. So Seti, as a graduate student, is exposed to all of this, Norwegian influence on oceanography. And when he is transferred back to California in 1937 to take over the sardine collapse and figure out what went wrong, he's placed in charge of that. And he's apparently a very charming individual, good at disarming conflict, good at coming into a situation like that and managing it, I think, pretty well. So he is the obvious person to put in charge of this new laboratory in Honolulu. And I'm going to do a little sidestep here. There are actually 4 new investigative fishery things being set up at this period. POFI gets all the attention, but there's one in the Atlantic, there's one in the Gulf, and there's one in the Pacific Northwest, headed out of Seattle. And its research vessel is the John Cobb, shown here on her launch. And for the next, 60, 70 years, the Cobb becomes the primary, I think certainly the primary, the first research vessel in the North Pacific. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are people here today who at least know the boat or perhaps sailed upon her, but I wanted to kind of bring this in to show that this is all kind of happening at the same time. And on one of its first cruises, the Cobb discovers the Cobb seamount and the rich groundfish resources around it. So, and that particular voyage was something that was orchestrated out of Honolulu by Seti. And what he was doing was having his research ships throughout the Pacific coordinate on finding tuna stocks, because POFI is really focused on trying to find tuna. And the idea is that if they can find tuna in the Pacific, and they know that there are tuna because the Japanese had a big fishery on tuna in the Marshall, the Mariana, and the Caroline Islands in the 1930s. So the Americans are trying to find out all they can about tuna in hopes of starting a fishery so that they will have a territorial claim to the fish now that the war is over and the Japanese fleet is confined to its, its home waters, very tiny area around the Sea of Japan. So there's kind of a race going on here, a race for tuna and a race for fish. So, so all of this is happening. And there's a big conference. POFI has a conference in Los Angeles in '49, and they're trying to, pool all their information about tuna. And this is a line from their report that we have a great deal of interest in tuna, but there really isn't a fish that we know less about. So up comes Bell Shimada and the reconnaissance effort to Japan. And this is a document from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, the Natural Resource Section. This is from the National Archives in the University of Maryland at College Park. And it is a press release from November of '48. And it talks about the party of American fishery scientists arriving in Tokyo. Fred Cleaver is the project leader. He's another University of Washington graduate. Bell is a biologist. And David Maiuchi is there as a technologist and who's kind of helping with the processing aspects of things. And the specific Oceanic Fisheries investigation is reporting everything comes back to Honolulu and to Oscar Seti. So here we have Bell and Fred Cleaver. Looks like they're playing around with some tuna. I think that's a scout photograph, I'm not quite sure. And what Alan was able to share with me is that Bell kept a journal of the time that he was in Japan. And he starts out, it's a 3-ring binder, just basic, typed on loose leaf paper. So this are the first entries. He's arrived, as you can see, he's met the staff of the Fisheries Division. And 2 days later, he's completed the operational outline. And what he is looking for is information about, and Japanese knowledge about tuna and ocean conditions. He's got a list of papers that he's looking for, basically anything on tuna and ocean conditions. He's looking to get a copy of it. And if it's in Japanese, there are at least 4 translators who are working at SCAP doing translation. So Bell is one of them, but there are several others. So if he can get hold of the document, he can have it translated and can and has have it translated. He's also sending specimens, fish that have been caught, and you notice he's, where it was caught, longitude and latitude. That's all going back to Honolulu, to Seti. And maybe the biggest thing that he sent back was there had been a conference in Japan in December of 1930, and they had brought their leading tuna scholars together, or leading academics, oceanographers together, and they had pooled their information about tuna and ocean conditions. And Bell and another translator, Wilden Van Kampen, are involved in translating these documents, and Bell edits it for publication in 1950. So a very significant set of documents summarizing Japanese science around tuna. So all of this is heading to Seti, And the research vessels have come online about this time. So that information is heading to Seti as well. And the first of them is the Oregon, which is a private research vessel. If you check onto my Pacific Fishery History Project blog, there's a lot about the Oregon written by Bob Heitz, who got me interested in all of that. But the Oregon's setting sail looking for tuna out of Hawaii in the very first voyages. And the Hugh M. Smith has come online, which is the first of the three vessels that was built with the funds from 1949. And Seti hires some really interesting people. He puts together a really strong epistemic community based in Hawaii with some really sharp people. So on the right, it's at least my right, is Townsend Cromwell, who had just graduated from, I think, University of California, LA, but he had done classes at Scripps under Harold Sverdrup. And Harold Sverdrup was the famed Norwegian oceanographer who came to Scripps in 1934. So Cromwell went to sea with probably the strongest and most current set of theoretical knowledge about oceanography that probably anyone had ever had, at least in the Pacific. And he's on board the Hugh Smith, and he sets his gear, he's long lining to try to catch some tuna, and the floats keep kind of floating away from him in a way that he does not expect. And a couple of years later, in 1952, he's still on board the Hugh Smith, and he finds the data that proves the existence of an equatorial current that nobody had suspected it was there. And that current currently bears its name. That's the Cromwell current. The other person, the headshot here, is Milner Bailey Schaefer, another graduate from the University of Washington School of Fisheries. And he becomes the first director of the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission when it's created in 1951. Very well-regarded, well-respected fishery scientist in his day. And it is his work around tuna for Pofi and in the Pacific that forms the basis for his surplus production theory ideas. So there's some really stellar people working for Seti and Honolulu. I'm not saying that he did everything himself, but when it came time to publish the document, the synthesis of all of this research, it's published in 1954. This is the cover page. Progress in Pacific Oceanic Fishery Investigations, 1950 to 53. And Seti writes the document with the staff, the POFI staff. And it's a really tight document. It's about 50 pages of text and another 25 pages of footnotes. And I was really struck when I read them about how many footnotes were there from Japanese scholars. And it got me really curious about this knowledge transfer and the role that this Japanese prior information played in the development of this sort of fisheries theory. So Bell continues to have a really stellar career, kind of straight up the ladder. He meets Rei Shimajimo in Honolulu. She's Seti's secretary. So Alan and his sister Julie are really, kind of descendants of U.S. Fish and Wildlife on both sides. He does some doctoral classes at UW in 1951. The Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission is created in 1951. Benny Schaefer is the director, and he immediately hires Thomas Cromwell and Bell Shimada to work with him out of La Jolla. Bell finishes his doctorate in 1956. Alan and Julie are born. And he's about to be named to a new position. He's going to be the new bureau chief of a new division, the Eastern Pacific Tuna Investigations. And he and Cromwell are on their last voyage together when there's the plane crash with 45 people dead, 8 of them from San Diego, 2 of them these very significant scientists. So that's kind of most of what I wanted to it's just a brief outline. Oh, that's an Alan slide. I'm going to turn things over to Alan. He's got a couple of slides. I just wanted to say this, and then I'm going to turn things over to Alan. There's a bunch of information about Bell on the blog, the Pacific Fishery History Project. I've got 2 stories about him, and there's also a link to a really good biography at the University of Washington that was done as part of his their centennial year. And it's a little hard to find on the site because it's really layered, but there's a link to it on the blog. So if you're interested in Bell, there's more information about him. So I want to go to previous. Oh dear, this may have been a previous. I maybe shouldn't have tried to do this. Alan, let me hope that I can get back to your slide. I didn't get all of that put together. Alan, so each time, can you bring him in?
Yeah, Alan.
Hi, I just unmuted. Am I coming through?
Yeah, you're coming through just fine. I'm going to ask to start your video.
Okay, it's not really.
I've got it.
Video. Okay. Are you seeing this this first slide called "Navigating the Future"?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much, Carmel. And let me publicly say here for the first time that I've greatly respected your work. I'm thrilled to be collaborating with you professionally now after having corresponded with you over the last several years. The subject matter, of course, is near and dear to my heart, and professionally and personally, of course. So what I thought I would do is just share 2 slides and sort of bring everyone up to the present day. So skipping from 1958, when both Townsend Cromwell and Bell Shimada were lost in that crash. Let's skip 50 years. And then this story then picks up in 2008. At this time, NOAA Fisheries is embarking on a construction program of what turns out to be 5 new fishery survey vessels, a class named after the first fishery survey vessel. They're called FSV 40s, 40-day endurance. Oscar Dyson is the very first FSV constructed in 2005 and is currently, or was originally, assigned to the Alaska Fishery Science Center working in Alaska. Henry Bigelow is the second FSV working out of Woods Hole. NOAA ship Pisces, the third, is supporting the Southeast Fishery Science Center out of Pascagoula, Mississippi, and Bell M. Shimada is the 4th FSV. Then followed by the 5th and final, the Reuben Lasker, which is home ported in San Diego, working for Southwest, primarily for Southwest Fishery Science Center. So Bigelow, Shimada, and Pisces were named through a student competition. NOAA in the early 2000s thought that would be a good public outreach, I guess, idea. And this slide here is the story behind the naming of Bell Shimada. These 5 kids submitted a 2-page nomination based on their research of Bell, using, I guess, the internet, being a public resource now for kids. The interesting thing is this is a brand new high school, Marina High School, at the time of this contest, had just started its classes. There were only the freshman and sophomore class. were the inaugural classes for this high school. It was Marina High Schools in Marina, California. It's based on the old Fort Ord site. And they chose pretty much a nautical theme for their mascot and sort of their school identity. And so when this contest came up, they of course thought it was, a natural, but not really thinking that they had much of a chance. They went ahead and submitted their application. It's really quite a sweet story, and if you Google around, you'll be able to find the details to that. But I wanted to take the opportunity here to show their picture and at least put them on the map for their contribution. Okay, we can go to the next slide.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Part of your slide. Yeah.
Okay. So, are people seeing this? There's another box overlaying it. Is that getting in the way?
We do see the picture of
The ship.
Oh, just that? Okay. This is commissioning day on Pier 66 in Seattle. As it happens, this past Monday marks the 10th anniversary of the commissioning of Belle Shimada, which was on May 25th, 2010. And as you can see, it was a beautiful, gorgeous day in Seattle. I remember Mount Rainier was very clear and striking. And this was really quite the day. Shimada principally serves the Northwest Fishery Science Center now, but also, of course, serves the Southwest Fishery Science Center. Shimada primarily surveys the Pacific hake stocks off the West Coast, and it's a primary survey vessel for that. And so it's quite significant to, the local Pacific Northwest fisheries. Coincident with this anniversary date and Carmel's talk is that this morning there was supposed to have been a change of command ceremony, transferring command from Captain Jesse Stark to Commander Amanda Geller. But due to COVID and other health protocols being put in place, that unfortunately has been postponed, and hopefully at a later date we can advertise a video link to a virtual change of command ceremony. And I'm sure Commander Geller would be pleased if you would dial in for that if you're interested. So that's pretty much it from my end. And we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for that, Alan. I would like to see if anyone has any questions for Carmel or Alan from online. I don't see any questions from folks online. Oh, let's see here. If you do have a question, please post in the chat, or if you want to ask it verbally, please do so. I don't seem to see anyone there. Oh, here we go. Okay, we have a question. We have several questions. All right, here we go. When can we expect the book to be finished?
Who asked that?
Kim asked that.
We're working on it.
Okay.
But it's a very rich story. I really enjoyed uncovering this and looking at the role that a single individual can play in having such an impact on the development of the science. So, you know, this reconnaissance mission and the work that he did, he was, you know, ideally suited for it. When he went back to SCAP as part of the reconnaissance mission, he was certainly welcomed back because he had been there for 6 months. He was highly respected. There's a series of letters of commendation about him from his various days during the military, and they all cite his professionalism and his competence and how intelligent he is and how you know, well-liked. So he was really an ideal ambassador to be able to go to these Japanese scientists and to ask for their papers and to translate them. And I'm sure that he did it in a, you know, just a very, very respectful way. So it's been, we tend to think about the development of the sciences as coming from the North Europeans, from, you know, particularly with fisheries, with the Norwegians, with Horton, with Sverdrup and things like that. But there was just also a really strong push of science coming from the East as well, from Japan. And I think it's really important to recognize that.
Carmel, there's another question, and the question is for you specifically around maritime history seems very unique. What attracted you to this study?
Wow. What attracted me to this was I covered the collapse of West Coast groundfish as a newspaper reporter in the 1990s. And I just got really interested in what happened. I thought that, you know, fishery science was this really specific, I mean, I had a lot of faith in the science that was being done because I didn't really know anything about it. And then everything kind of collapsed, and I got very interested in why it collapsed and, you know, what was wrong. So that really prompted me to go to University of California, San Diego, and I was able to study there with Naomi Oreskes, who some of you might know from some of her work on development of oceanography, and of course the name of her most recent book just went straight through my mind. And oh my God, look at how messy it is behind me. So that's really what prompted it. And I read a paper that Raymond Beverton had written about the meeting in Rome in 1955 that was really the start of the law of the sea process. And he wrote that it was not a scientific process, that it was a political one. And I didn't know much about the science, but I did know a lot about the politics. And that really got me interested in how politics shapes science. And I think that there's a lot of evidence of it within fishery science. And I think it's part of the reason that some things have not been as right as they could be if they had focused a little more on the science and not on the policy.
Thank you. There's another question online, and it's from Jack Barth. How did Cal Coffee's launch also in '49 relate to all of this?
You can look at Cal Coffee, or you can look at the collapse of sardines on the West Coast as being the catalyst event for bringing research efforts together to try to figure out what was wrong. And when Seti arrived in 1937 to take over for the collapse of California sardines, he reached out to all of the universities, to the scholars, to the agency people. And he had a yearly conference that he was doing, trying to kind of bring everybody together. He was very much someone who was interested in knowing what other people thought. Dr. Bill Piercy, who is here, knew Seti. I played tennis with him in Honolulu when Dr. Piercy was a graduate student, and he told me how affable Seti was, and how, you know, he was interested in knowing what the graduate students thought. And he held, you know, these seminars where everyone was welcome, and all of this information is being, you know, is being generated, and people are talking about it and interpreting it. It must have been just an enormously exciting intellectual time with, you know, kind of all of this coming together and all of these really bright people working together, trying to kind of figure out what was going on. Just a really important epistemic community. And I think, you know, that he was at the center of it, and he really hasn't been given as much credit as he deserves in the development of the science. And that might be something for some of the scientists who are in the audience, if you agree or disagree with that.
Carmel, adding to that, and I think you kind of touched a little bit about that, is Nancy Steinberg added another additional to Jack's question on how did these fishery science efforts connect to budding physical oceanographic studies of the time? And how did the biologists and physicists begin to work together?
I'm not sure how the biologists and the physicists began working together. What I was looking at and trying to uncover was what was kind of the fishery science contribution to all of this. Because you know, we talk about biological oceanography, and we talk about, you know, kind of, you know, some people are studying the bottom, and some people are studying the top. It seems to me that fisheries are kind of, you know, kind of sort of studying in the middle. So I'm not really sure, you know, that I could directly answer that, but this is the first time in a couple of decades when there are ships at sea doing basic oceanographic research. And I think that there are certainly geoscientists a little later on who are publishing and going back to the work that Cromwell did on the Hugh Smith, and you know, kind of confirming his results and what they meant. So I might have known somebody who would ask me a really detailed question about oceanography that I really don't understand very well. But I think that, you know, what we have here are some building blocks are being made. There is a system being put together. There's a research system is being built, and it goes off in a lot of different directions from there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So we have another question from Michael Banks, and it's, were there any observation on Bell's influence to fisheries management in other oceans?
Sverdrup's book was published in 1942. So that was basically, as I understand it, is the first oceanography textbook. And I haven't read it, so I don't know the answer to that. My thought is, and Alan could correct me if I'm wrong, is that all of his work was pretty much on the Pacific. And I've been interested in the Pacific because it, so much of the history of science that's been done is all on the Atlantic. And the Atlantic, fisheries developed over hundreds of years, and changes were quick, but nowhere near as quick as things were in the Pacific. In the Pacific, we have this enormous technological transfer taking place, and fisheries start and collapse in less than a decade. You know, one example is, you know, kind of off Oregon with our shark fishery for liver oil during the war. So I've kind of confined what I do to the Pacific because I'm interested in that. I'm interested in that story, and I'm especially interested in the kind of the knowledge transfer with Japan.
Another question here. Do you have any insight into how closely current U.S. fisheries researchers collaborate with their Japanese counterparts?
I don't know. That's a great question. I wish I knew. It was really, I think that's something that it would be great to be able to study, is the technology transfer from Japan, but also from the Soviet Union. So the whole story of development in the North Pacific is this, collaborative efforts with the Japanese and the Russians and the Canadians and the Americans. And you have this co-construction of the science over this, really huge geographical area. And how that was done, I'm very interested in that. And I wish there was, more people looking at the collaboration and the knowledge transfer and, how ideas and hypotheses came together. And there was that, again, an epistemic community, a widely based epistemic community coming together beyond the restrictions of agencies and things, and putting together this really rich picture of development in the Pacific. So I wish that there were more people looking at these issues.
Thanks, Carmel. A couple more questions. One that was raised, and I think a really interesting one from a kind of a cultural perspective, which was Bell's family interned for the duration of the war? Do we know that?
Maybe we could go to Alan for that. I know Ray was interned. Alan, do you have more information about that? I know they were interned, but I don't know for how long.
Right, yeah. Bell's family from Seattle, I believe they all went to Minidoka, Idaho. Ray was from Portland, and so her family were all sent to Tule Lake, which is in the northern California-Oregon border. So yes, they were interred.
Wow. One final question it looks like here is, if a grad student was looking for a good research question on Bell Shimada's work, where would you point them, especially a topic that resonates in the present?
I think it's interesting to want to know, kind of what was the state of Japanese science in 1940, to look at those papers that Bell translated, and did they know? What ideas did they have? And I'm a historian. I'm not the person to read those documents and kind of see where they were, but I think that's a really, that would be an interesting thing to look at. What did they know? Were there kind of, central insights that, did transfer? How important was that work? How formative was it? And I can't really make an assessment about that, but someone who had the science would be able to do that. And I think it would be, a really interesting project as we look at this, kind of rich construction, coming in with all of this information, synthesis and the collaboration. And so I think it would be great if somebody else would take a whack at taking a look at it.
So this is Alan. I'm certainly happy to take any, inquiries along those lines. So please feel free to email me, alan.shimada@noaa.gov. This also gives me an opportunity to do a shout out or advertisement for the American Institute of Fishery Research Biologists, AIFRB, which was formed in 1956 at the University of Washington. It was 26 founding fellows, of which W.F. Thompson was the principal. Benny Schaefer was a founding fellow. There were many other luminaries, names that certainly anyone in our field would recognize. And so please direct any grad students to check out aifrb.org. It's very much tied in with all of the personalities and the professional work and accomplishments community that we've been speaking of, and particularly the Northwest Pacific Islands and all along the West Coast. So I invite you to check that out.
And can I add one thing there? Am I live?
Mhm.
Am I talking? Are you hearing me? There was just a note that came through that one of the people who was involved in this was, of course, Warren Wooster. And one of the reasons I didn't want to start naming the people, you know, the really bright people who were involved in POFI, because I knew that I would leave some of those people out. So certainly Warren Wooster was involved in this and played a really critical role in the development of Pisces. One of the things that's surprising about this is what a tiny little group of people it was. I mean, it was a very small group, and they all knew each other and more or less supported each other and worked together. So I think that's maybe part of the effectiveness of it that made the technology transfer so quick, was that it was a relatively small group of people working together, and results didn't have to be disseminated. So definitely Warren Wooster was involved, Al Tester, just a long slew of distinguished scientists, Albert Day. They're all connected to POFI and the work that came after that. So it's I think a very distinguished chapter in federal fisheries science that hasn't been given the attention that it deserves.
Well, thank you, Carmel. Thank you, Alan, for joining us today. I want to thank everyone else online for joining us today. It's really a special treat to be able to hear about Bell Shimada and have Alan join us as well. So we do look forward to seeing that book. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us again today. If there aren't any more questions, I think we'll end here. And then Carmel, if you, I'll send you another link to meet with our students following this at 4:40.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this, inviting Alan and I to do this.
Oh yeah, this was great. Thank you. Thank you, Alan.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all for your interest.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay.